You're watching Face to Face, and I'm your host, Tim Vince. Today we will be talking about a day in the life of a chaplain, and I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Sijuwade. Welcome, Michael.
Hello to you,
Face
Tim.
to Face, and in specifics, it's not the life of a chaplain in the army, it's being a chaplain in hospital. And I'd love to go through that with you.
Correct.
But first, Michael, how did you come to know the Lord?
Well, I was at university up in Newcastle, and I do recall in 1991 I received a letter, an airmail, not an email, but an airmail letter, one of those blue letters from my father, who was then in Nigeria. Yeah. A man had come to my father's house and actually said that he was a prophet. My father thought, yeah, right. But this man went on to say, you have a son in England. And that got my father's attention. This so-called prophet said, God says to your son, I see his ways, I see his heart, but his ways are not my ways. Caution him or else. When I received that letter, it was almost, yes, the kick up the backside. Why? Because if I'd lived in London, I would have said someone had reported me. Newcastle, no one knew me from Adam. Yeah. So when I got that letter, I had a decision to make. Do I continue being Jack the Lad? Or do I make a commitment to the faith that I had been introduced to by my parents way back? And so it was in 1991 during the first Gulf War, I made a commitment to faith in Christ Jesus.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it resonates with me because I was a bit of a Jack the Lad in my teenage years, and believe it or not, hard to believe now. But it's wonderful when you have family who are praying for you, and then in God's timing, you come through.
So correct, because we have 3 wonderful daughters as well, and we know that, yes, you can do as much for your children, but there comes a point in time where they have to find their faith in God for themselves. And that parents cannot engineer, you have to live them, but in the background, parents still continue to pray. So I still have parents who are in their late 80s and 90s, still praying for myself and their grandchildren. So it's wonderful to have a rich parental Christian heritage. Yeah.
And, our title is A Day in the Life of a Chaplain. I'm really interested to unpack that because it's one thing to be preaching to the converted and to be in a wonderful Christian environment, a church environment. It's quite another to actually be, as it were, on the coalface, dealing with a whole range of people in different walks of life who are in great need. Tell us a little bit about your day.
Well, just a little bit, let's go a little bit back.
Please.
Now, in my culture, where I grew up in Nigeria, if your dad's a lawyer, as a first son, you study law. So my dad was an engineer. So, my son, you're going to study engineering. Yeah. And that's what I did. I studied agriculture engineering at university. But I always knew I had a call of God upon my life, even before I met my wife, Ola. And before we got married, I did tell her I had a call. I then, by default, got married and was like, oh, I got to work. And I stumbled into IT. Having worked in IT for 12 years, which was quite successful, that call never left. And I knew at some point I had to respond. We then moved out of London to Letchworth. And we came across an Elim church, and the pastor then was just so good. Pastor Mark Rand came to our home, and eventually we became part of that network of churches. And that's where I began to do my ministerial training as an MIT, Minister in Training. Not knowing that on one occasion we were going to go to conference, and as we have within Elim conferences, we have 2 main sessions in the morning and in the evening. But during the daytime, we have seminars. And I stumbled across a seminar for chaplains.
Wow.
In that room, there were less than 20. This is probably about 12, 13 years ago. Because at that point in time, Elim had gotten wind that chaplaincy is an area of ministry that we were not yet in, and we need to do something about it. When I sat in that conference, I was thinking, why aren't they banging the drums, beating the drum beats loud enough for people to be? I got the chaplaincy bug. And then at that point in time, we were also contemplating planting a church. And I would go out on the streets, and I thought, well, where God had called us to plant church was predominantly white. And as you've noticed, Tim, I'm not white.
No.
And I thought, how do I come across legit, is the phrase I use. And I devised to get myself a yellow fluorescent jacket, and I put community chaplain on the back. But you cannot be part of a chaplain without belonging to a chaplaincy.
Yeah.
And so hence I began to investigate what chaplaincies were around. I then realized that I could belong to the NHS, I could become an NHS chaplain as a volunteer. So I did start out as a volunteer under the mentorship of a good friend of mine called Canon Reverend Jane Hatton from the Church of England. Yeah. And the rest is history, whereby when the vacancies came about, she made me aware. And then I submitted my application. And today, almost 10 years later, I'm one of the NHS healthcare chaplains within the Eastern Northwards.
That is absolutely brilliant. I attended the 100th anniversary of the Elim Church up in Harrogate, and they're magnificent, uplifting conferences. So it's very interesting that it started there. And yeah, so, you know, as I say, it's one thing to be in a Christian environment, you know, in the church or a family home, or it's quite another, isn't it, to be out there in society ministering to folks. So you felt a calling to do it, but any other preparation that was of use to you?
I had done a year in full-time ministry, and at that point in time, a situation arose whereby it's either I was pushed to jump because we had to employ a youth worker and we didn't have enough money in the coffers. And at that same point in time, the door opened for chaplaincy. And so I could only but believe it was God's timing. Now, when you work full-time ministry, you work and speak the same language with everyone around you. But chaplaincy is very different, because chaplaincy is us operating pastoral, religious, or spiritual care within a non-Christian or spiritual environment or religious environment. And so the hospital where I work, I'm one of a team of 8. And so I work with the Buddhists, Hindu, Sikh, Humanist, Roman Catholic. And it means that you have to be confident in who you are. Now, as a chaplain, you cannot be everything to everyone. So I'm not going to pretend to be an imam. I have my colleagues. So when we meet patients or members of staff that need specific religious care, we triage that out.
And do they ask for it, or do you discover it? So you're there in a situation where you're, as it were, on the wards, or you and you discover a need, or are you only responding to requests?
Our trust is very different, because whilst most other trusts probably have a predominantly Christian chaplaincy, that's how we started out. But some 6 years ago, the manager then, or team lead, was given the remit to actually transform or transition the chaplaincy team. And so we evolved from just being Christian-based to the diversity that we have, the multi-faith and belief that we have. And that's because of the demographics of patients that we have. And our referrals come from different quarters. We have referrals from churches saying there's a congregational member, from family. We have referrals coming from our volunteers, because again, they're an integral part of what we do. But I'm wired to engage everyone.
Yeah, that's the point, yeah.
And so as much as I may have the referrals, for example, I can give you, just this week, coming to an end, I went through A&E. And as much as A&E was busy, I heard a young Afro-Caribbean girl screaming. I couldn't walk past. I engaged her. She suffered from sickle cell, and she was crying at the top of her voice. And I looked around, and one of the ward managers came up to me and said, "Michael, we are aware. Don't think we're ignoring her," and gave me a little bit of background. And I stayed with her and prayed at least for 5 minutes, praying in the spirit, praying with my understanding, until the screaming dampened down a bit. I then, before I left work, beyond 5:30, I went back to see this young lady. She was still in some discomfort, but the screaming had stopped. And so, hence, as much as we get referrals, we also get
spontaneous
where we have to respond. And so hence why I liken chaplaincy to the story of the Good Samaritan.
So you're in a situation where you can't just barge in to someone's space, but if they ask for your help, you can talk the gospel? Because you must be dealing with folks who are nearing the end as well. So it's a very critical time.
Tim, being a chaplain is a privilege, because as much as with church folks, as a minister, to some extent, your audience or your congregation are the people that meet with you on a Sunday. With chaplaincy, when I was commissioned almost 10 years ago, it was as though I was given the full reign of the hospital. So as chaplains, we go not just onto the wards, but we also go into the anesthetic room and theatre, if requested by the patient. Our role is to come alongside the patient. So I'm very careful not to impose my faith, but opportunities have risen on many occasions where people have asked me my faith, dealing with end of life, and they're fearful. Michael, how do you deal with fear? I let them know Romans 5:5, perfect love drives out all fear. And I tell them about faith in Christ Jesus. And I have seen many, or should I say at least a few, come to faith as a result of the ministry God has given me within my trust.
Wonderful. And then I just considering the NHS and hospitals, you can't ignore the COVID pandemic.
Oh no.
And so you were in the thick of that, so to speak. How did, just tell us part of the story. You can't tell us all of it.
No, I can't tell you all of it. But I remember being on holiday on the 15th of March, 2020. And I came back on the 1st of April, and my hospital had changed. Where you could walk into an open bay was all partitioned. I even had to go on an induction course. I'll be honest, I struggled during that time, during that period. To see a consultant break down, to see 3 patients in a bay and 2 are recovering, but the 3rd patient is actually gasping for breath. Doctor, is there anything else you can do? And they say, there's nothing they can do. Now, things are different now, but then you could actually sense the fear in the atmosphere. And so, I'll be honest, my faith was challenged because my wife and myself are people of prayer. And we know God can do all things, and we know God is almighty, but then, God, where are you in the midst of all this? Was my question. Because I would go in, I use the word surrogate as a chaplain. Some hospitals worked via proxy, but we still went in. So we'd have the full PPE gear put on us with 3M masks, with visors and goggles and things of that nature, sellotaped gloves. And I remember the first time I went in to see a patient, I was still the novelty of being done by a nurse. And then the doctor pops his head out saying the patient have just come to see, has just passed.
Oh.
That was to me, that was almost like a slap in the face to say, wake up, son. This is not about taking photographs. This is about coming alongside the individuals, because family members could not come in then. So we were the ones getting referrals from family, from local parishes to say, can you please go in on our behalf?
Wow.
And even though I belonged to a team of 8, only 2 of us could do that because some had health issues or age and had to isolate.
Yeah. And did you, it must have been awkward in these critical situations. Was there some resentment? Were you in the way, as it were? Did you feel in the way when there's these sort of intense situations of life and death? How does it work? It's just hard to imagine.
I do believe, I didn't feel in the way at all. What actually transpired was that the medical profession realized how spiritual care was vital, especially to those who are end of life. And to be honest, I do believe as a result of that experience, it actually probably highlighted the role of chaplaincy or spiritual and pastoral caregivers within the NHS Trust. So right now, and during that time period, I also journeyed with lots of staff members, because patients are transient, they come and go, but staff members remain. So I'm also training to be a counselor, because in terms of mental health care, mental health issues are on the rise. And even though I'm an ordained minister and a chaplain, I felt training myself to become a qualified counselor would help me in better stead, put me in better, enable me provide a better level of care to my colleagues further down the road.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about that scenario exactly. You know, with the colleagues, with the doctors, the nurses, and where the chaplain fits in. Because in other parts of society where we've had chaplains, they tend to be marginalised. But it sounds like the position is respected and honoured.
Tim, within my trust, I engage the cleaners, the porters, and I point this way. But then I sit with the chief nursing officer, which I did last week, to say, how are you doing? So as a chaplain, they see us as neutral. I don't personally have an agenda. So when I actually say to you, Tim, how are you? It's because I really do care. When you say you're a people person, you need to be authentic and real. And when you're real, people know that he's got your back. She's got your back. And they're able to open up. And then that allows you the opportunity to actually share your faith and the difference Christ makes. And so for me, during the pandemic, I had to resolve that no matter how many deaths I see, because I paused there because there were many, and there were colleagues as well. It doesn't change who God is. God is, by nature, he's good, he's kind, he's loving, he's almighty, and can do anything. And so I resolved to remain faithful to my faith in Christ Jesus.
That's wonderful. Now, alongside being a chaplain, which seems pretty intense and full-time, you're sort of planting churches and pastoring a church. How do you manage to balance the two?
I'll be honest,
Yes.
hand on heart, I couldn't do what I'm doing without my good wife, my understanding wife, because I do recall when I went for the interview to go into ministry, we had done my presentation and the head of my denomination said, any questions? And before I knew it, my wife said, how much is going to get paid?
Oh, really?
And he said £12.50 and we all cracked up laughing. No, really, how much? And he said, well, you're going to belong to this church, you're ministering training, and he made a certain amount. And the amount he said was a third of what I was bringing home at that point in time in my previous profession as an IT technical accounts manager. But like I said, it was high time I answered the call. And answering the call, I do recall one of my daughters saying, Daddy, we became poor when you started working for the church.
Yes.
It's not easy to be a chaplain 4 days a week, and even because we're short staffed, I do 2 weekends a month. And then we've planted the church from the mother church in Letchworth called Letchworth Garden City Church. We're now called Shalom Community Church based in Sandy. God's been faithful.
Yeah.
We saw growth up to about 60 in 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and numbers fell. But my wife and myself have resolved that we're going to remain faithful to what God has called us. I'll be honest, it does take its toll, especially when you have children. You're putting your children on the streets to hand out flyers. You're doing street engagement, things of that nature, because if you're going to plant church, if you're going to grow church, you've got to engage with the community. And we didn't live in that community till just over 8 months ago. So God's been faithful to what he's called us to do. And we say this, if God has not given up on us, we have no right to give up on the work God has called us to do.
Yeah, wonderful. So the other balance that comes to mind is being out and out as a Bible-believing Christian testifying to the gospel, and in a world that's increasingly secular, you know, and in some cases hostile to the Christian faith. How do you manage that balance? Because you know, even it's very brave of you to come on to face in one sense. You know, you need a lot of wisdom, don't you, to navigate the minefield.
Wisdom is the principal thing.
Yeah.
Do all you can to get wisdom. Yes, Tim, it's a minefield out there. And as I've said, I'm a size 9.5, but I have to tread carefully because chaplaincy is very different to full-time ministry or church ministry. Because with chaplaincy, you're going to come across people that would never step into a church.
Yeah.
And you're going to come across people that don't even have the concept of God. But when people are faced with life and death situations. The issue of spirituality comes into play. What's important to that person? How can that person connect with those things that are important to them? I give an example. A lady passed away in a nursing home a few years ago, and in her hands she held onto two things. One was a piece of paper, and one was an item of faith. The item of faith was a cross. The piece of paper was a letter from her grandchild. So in her passing, she had her faith, and she had family. The pandemic also allowed people to recalibrate what things are important to them. And in my Bible study of yesterday, one thing that's needed, Jesus Christ said to Martha, your sisters chose that, and that's to abide and to sit with Christ. And so for me to navigate the complexities of chaplaincy, it's important that I have my morning devotion with Christ, that I'm sensitive to the Holy Spirit, and I'm also sensitive to the environment I'm walking into, because I'm called when people give birth to babies. But a lot of what I do are stillbirths or miscarriages, of counseling individuals that have just lost loved ones, and people that, again, like I've said, don't have the Christian faith. But there are times you can demonstrate the love of Christ by not by what you say, but what you do. I have letters and emails of even just recently, a young lady came, a mother brought her daughter to work for an appointment at the hospital. I engaged them in the lift. And then when I dropped my things in the office, I went back to where they were. And she actually took the time to say, he didn't have to do this, but he came to check upon us. And she sent that into the trust. Again, that's just the love of Christ in action. And again, that's why I say the work of a chaplain is very similar to this parable of the Good Samaritan. You need to get down from your donkey, roll up your sleeves, pour oil and wine on the individual, bind up their wound, put that person on your donkey, take that person to their inn at your expense, and check upon the person upon your return. There are times God has allowed me to see the end of a situation, of a scenario, like I journeyed to the family 18 months prior. They just lost their baby, and I did the funeral. And then at the service that we have once a year, that couple came back and they had a car seat.
Oh.
And after the service, they turned the car seat towards me, and there was Caleb, their boy.
Oh.
So to journey with them 18 months prior and then 18 months later, and to see what God has done, wonderful. But that's not the case for everyone. So I'm mindful of that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say every situation is different. Literally, every person has a different story, a different need.
Correct.
So that's, we're sort of in the final minutes, Michael. If we were to say to the viewers, please pray for Michael in his ministry, what would you ask folks to pray for?
If I were to speak to you viewers, not just pray for Michael, but pray for all chaplains. And that's because we're under pressure. We're short-staffed. But having said that, Tim, pray for God's wisdom. And also pray for the work balance, because at times you never switch off. And if you don't switch off, that can have a negative impact on family. So as much as I'm a chaplain and a church minister, I'm also a husband. I'm also a father. I'm also a son and a brother and uncle. And I have to take those responsibilities and hold them and hold that tension. And so God's wisdom is paramount, and God's protection, because again, I was so privileged that during the pandemic, God really protected me. Even before the vaccination came out, I was protected, even though I must say, I did get COVID 2.5 years later.
Okay.
But there were no symptoms, but God healed me through that.
Wow. So we'll pray for your health, strengthening your family, your church.
Yes.
For growth in the church.
Please, yes.
And, for that prayer support that you can have locally.
Yes.
I was a bit premature in saying we had a few minutes left. So we've gone through, I've sort of jabbed into different areas of a day in the life of a chaplain. Just rattle through now in the final 2 minutes getting up in the morning to going to bed at night. A day in the life of a chaplain.
Indeed, life of a chaplain now, for Michael, is the fact that I wake up early and I go downstairs and have my time of devotion. In the past, I would go to the gym, but now...
you don't need it, I can see that.
So it's having that devotion, and then from time to time, I may go upstairs, pray with Allah, my wife, or get dressed and go to work. Once I get to work, it's a matter of looking at the patient list. I still work at the same pace I worked at almost 10 years ago. So my colleagues then said, Michael, slow down. I haven't. But I'm mindful because there was a time it was said to me, I give my best to my hospital and the family are left with the crumbs. So it's having that balance to make sure that when I get home, I'm able to switch off from work. If I'm tired, I take myself away and rest for about 30 minutes or an hour. And then I come back and then engage family, because family need my time. Whilst at the hospital, I'm engaging both patients and staff to ensure that as a team, we are ministering to, as I say, 3 categories of people: the patients, their relatives, and to staff.
Wow, what a blessing. Michael, I'm so pleased we've gone through this, and it's an inspiration to me, and I pray it will be an inspiration to many of you to go out and serve the Lord in these days, exciting days, but also very challenging. So thank you, Michael, and look forward to hearing more in the future.
Tim,
God bless you.
God bless you too. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And join us next time we go face to face.